Becoming Michael Jackson was never going to be as simple as putting on the right clothes or copying a few famous dance moves. For Jaafar Jackson, the challenge was much bigger. He wasn't simply trying to imitate one of the most recognizable performers in music history. He was preparing to portray his own uncle, a man whose movements, voice, personality, and presence had been studied by millions of people around the world. Every expression had to feel believable. Every movement had to have the right timing. Even the smallest details mattered. And according to Jaafar, the transformation took years of preparation before cameras ever began rolling. Long before stepping onto a film set, Jaafar spent countless hours studying Michael Jackson's performances. He watched the way Michael moved, listened carefully to his voice, and tried to understand the person behind the legendary performer. But he quickly realized that simply copying Michael wasn't enough. He wanted to understand Michael as a human being. That meant going deeper than music videos and concert footage. Jaafar wanted to discover the private side of Michael that audiences rarely saw. He studied Michael's writings, personal notes, journals, goals, and the things that revealed how Michael thought and felt. The deeper he went into that research, the more connected he became to the character. At one point, Jaafar even created what he described as a timeline room filled with information about different periods of Michael's life. It helped him understand where Michael was emotionally at different points in his career. That became especially important because the movie would not portray only one version of Michael Jackson. Michael changed dramatically throughout his career. His appearance, hairstyles, clothing, movements, and overall image evolved from one era to another. That meant Jaafar's transformation also had to change. The earlier years required one appearance, while later periods demanded something completely different. The team working on the film knew that recreating Michael's face would be one of their biggest challenges. Some features could be achieved through traditional makeup and prosthetics, but others were much more difficult. Michael's nose, for example, became a particular challenge. Jaafar naturally has a different nose shape, and the makeup team realized that prosthetics alone couldn't completely recreate Michael's distinctive appearance. They experimented with different approaches. Some of the early tests went too far. The goal wasn't to transform Jaafar so completely that audiences forgot who was playing Michael. They wanted viewers to recognize Michael while still understanding that Jaafar Jackson was the actor behind the performance. That balance became extremely important. The makeup department and visual effects team eventually worked closely together. Instead of treating makeup and digital effects as completely separate processes, they collaborated throughout the transformation. Certain details could be achieved physically on camera, while other elements required digital work afterward. The combination allowed them to create a much more convincing result without going too far. But looking like Michael was only one part of the challenge. Jaafar also had to move like Michael, and that proved to be one of the most difficult parts of the entire process. One of the first major tests involved Michael's legendary performance of Billie Jean from Motown 25. The choreography was broken down frame by frame. Jaafar had only 20 days to prove to the filmmakers that he could perform it convincingly. 20 days might sound like a reasonable amount of time, but for Jaafar, it felt almost impossible. He knew Michael's choreography was incredibly precise. It wasn't enough to know where each step went. He had to understand the timing, balance, rhythm, intensity, and attitude behind every movement. And at that point, Jaafar was still relatively new to acting. In fact, he had never acted professionally before. He admitted that acting wasn't something he had originally planned to pursue. His background was much more connected to music, producing, and songwriting. So before he could even attempt to embody Michael, he had to learn what acting actually required. He began working with an acting coach. For roughly a year, he studied the fundamentals of acting before focusing entirely on becoming Michael Jackson. Then the real transformation began. Jaafar started studying Michael's videos, lyrics, performances, and personality in much greater detail. He wasn't interested in simply creating an impression. He wanted to understand Michael well enough that the performance would eventually feel natural. That philosophy also influenced the way he approached Michael's dancing. After the initial 20-day challenge, Jaafar continued practicing privately. He eventually spent hours in a room filled with mirrors, recreating the type of environment where Michael himself would rehearse. He described the experience as almost spiritual. There was no audience, no cameras, no applause. It was simply Jaafar, the mirrors, the music, and the choreography. He treated it almost like a full-time job. Day after day, he repeated the same movements until his body began to understand them naturally. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was trying to reach the point where he could look into the mirror and believe that what he was seeing was Michael. And some movements were far more difficult than others. The moonwalk was one of the biggest challenges. As a child, Jaafar had tried the famous move like countless other fans. But attempting the moonwalk casually was completely different from performing it the way Michael did. Everything mattered. The floor, the shoes, the balance, the speed, even the direction of a spin. Jaafar normally spun to his right, while Michael often spun in the opposite direction. Changing that natural instinct was surprisingly difficult. He had to retrain his body to move differently, and Michael's spins weren't simply about turning around. They required incredible control. He had to stop at exactly the right moment, often matching the movement to a specific beat or snare hit. The slightest mistake could make the performance look completely different. This was the difference between copying Michael and actually recreating his performance style. Jaafar also spent a great deal of time working on Michael's speaking voice. That presented another challenge because Jaafar's natural voice was very different from his uncle's. At first, trying to speak like Michael sounded strange even to Jaafar himself. He described it as feeling silly at the beginning, but he kept practicing. One technique he used was reading books aloud in Michael's voice. With every book, he became more comfortable. Eventually, something interesting began to happen. The voice started appearing naturally. Jaafar noticed that sometimes he would be speaking to someone in an ordinary situation and suddenly realized that his voice sounded a little like Michael's without consciously trying to imitate him. That was exactly what he wanted. He didn't want the voice to feel like something he had to switch on. He wanted it to become instinctive. The same philosophy applied to everything else. The goal was never simply to put on Michael's appearance. It was to create a complete character. Jaafar's research into Michael's private life gave him another unexpected perspective. He discovered Michael's use of mantras, affirmations, meditation, and written goals. According to Jaafar, Michael would write down what he wanted to accomplish and repeatedly remind himself of those goals. He would spend time meditating and focusing on those affirmations. Jaafar found this fascinating. It showed him another side of Michael's personality. Michael's pursuit of greatness wasn't only about talent. It was also about discipline, repetition, belief, and preparation. Jaafar decided to incorporate some of that philosophy into his own preparation. The more he learned, the more he realized how much work Michael had put into becoming the performer the world eventually knew. And that understanding changed the way he approached the role. The audition process itself was also far from traditional. Jaafar didn't simply walk into one audition and receive the part. The process lasted almost 2 years. It began when producer Graham King contacted him and asked whether he had ever acted before. Jaafar admitted that he loved movies but had never really dreamed of becoming an actor. Then, after some time had passed, Jaafar sent King a spontaneous message. He recorded himself speaking in Michael's voice and singing as Michael. That message changed everything. King was impressed enough to call him back and arrange for him to work with a coach. That led to months of preparation. Eventually, the process continued for 6 months to a year before Jaafar reached the screen test stage. For the screen test, he appeared with the full hair and makeup transformation. That was when the filmmakers could finally see what the complete package looked like. For Jaafar, it was the culmination of an enormous amount of work. But even after he was chosen, the preparation wasn't finished. In many ways, it was only beginning. He had another 1.5 years to focus on the smallest details. He had to refine Michael's mannerisms, voice, choreography, acting, expressions, and physical presence. The pressure was enormous. But Jaafar continued. Eventually came the moment he had been preparing for. His first day on set. He remembered wearing the outfit associated with Michael's Bad era and preparing to perform the song Bad. The anticipation was overwhelming. He had spent years rehearsing privately. He had danced alone in front of mirrors. He had worked with choreographers. He had studied Michael. He had practiced his voice. Now, For the first time, there would be cameras and a film crew watching him. The excitement had been building for years. And when Jaafar finally stepped onto that set and performed, something remarkable happened. People who had known Michael personally began to react. Jaafar Jackson, Michael's brother, was deeply emotional after seeing Jaafar on screen. He said that many people could imitate Michael, but Jaafar was different. In his view, Jaafar didn't simply imitate Michael. He became Michael on screen. That reaction carried enormous weight because Jackie had spent decades watching Michael perform, rehearse, and live his life. He knew the little details. He knew Michael's presence. So seeing Jaafar capture that presence was especially meaningful. Jackie wasn't the only family member impressed. Tito Jackson also praised Jaafar's performance. He explained that what mattered most was seeing Michael in Jaafar. That was the goal from the beginning. Not a superficial imitation. Not a caricature. Not simply a performer wearing Michael's clothes. They wanted to see Michael's spirit and presence coming through the performance. Other members of Michael's family also reacted strongly. Marlon Jackson described the difference between ordinary Michael impersonators and Jaafar. He had seen countless people attempt to imitate his brother. But Jaafar's performance stood out. The reason was simple. He wasn't merely copying Michael.